Madison.
I'm Priyanka.
I'm Erin.
Brad.
Brendan.
And we are the Learning Disabilities Group. And so I think the first question that everyone asks us is, why do we choose learning disabilities? And it's a question that we find very easy to respond to, and it's something that, first of all, learning disabilities really resonates with our individual interest, and furthermore, we're relatively recent graduates of the public school system, K through 12, and it's something that we've seen firsthand how it affects the education system, individual level, the teacher level, and the education system as a whole. And so we've spent the last semester looking for an avenue in which we can really innovate this issue. So as evidenced by our timeline, we spent a great deal of time in the squiggle, which we took this approach because we really wanted to give a comprehensive analysis of all the avenues in which we could take to what would best suit this issue. So we went through a lot of different ways, and so a lot of them we realized, this wasn't going to work when we moved forward. A lot of things that we recognized that there was a lot of information that we uncovered through time. So as we researched more, we were better able to determine what would best suit this project. And so at the very end, we determined that a bill was the most effective way to really innovate this issue. And as evidence, we went through a lot of different ways and we evaluated them, and I think that's very important with our group, is that we weren't complacent with one issue. We really were comprehensive in how we were able to determine what was the most effective. And I think in terms of the information, a lot of the reason why we weren't able to uncover a lot of information very quickly on was because a lot of the information isn't readily available. Even after meeting with our representatives, they even then didn't have a lot of the questions that we needed to be answered immediately available. So it's something that took us a while to really dig up and uncover the information that we needed to make our final product.
Which final product is trying to be eco-friendly and not using one poster board makes for a bit of a difficult switch. I got it.
Looks like you're gonna do battery jumping.
Yeah. So, our product for this crate is both a physical product and a digital product. The product as a whole is our attack plan on how to go about addressing the issue of the lack of properly resourced inclusive classrooms in public schools. And for the sake of this presentation, we're defining inclusive classrooms as classrooms where both mainstream students and students with learning disabilities who have been determined to be able to successfully achieve in mainstream classrooms. So for the sake of this that's how we're defining inclusive classrooms. So our attack plan for this is a 5-pronged approach. Excuse me. And the first one and the primary one is through legislation. And in your folders, you will find a bill that we are looking to propose to the Pennsylvania State Congress and the House and or the Senate. We'll get into on that one. And I will let my colleague Erin really go into the details of the bill. I'm just going to give a brief overview of the product as a whole. Additionally, in your folder you'll also find a one-pager, and this is again a brief overview of the issue and what we would use to be able to hopefully distribute information to interested parties, specifically the congressman. The next approach is through special interest groups, which through our conversations and our contacts, we have established a number of organizations that are interested in our work and potentially want to partner to work on newsletters or other sorts of means to disseminate information. And again, I will let Priyanka go into a little more detail about that. The third route is through grassroots, and here in your again, in your folder for our physical product, you'll find a petition, and this is a petition that we are looking to circulate in conjunction with this infographic, which I'll let Brendan go into detail about. But the petition would come into action if and when our bill ends up on the Congress floor for an actual vote to try and raise awareness about it, to hopefully segue nicely into a call to action, which is, again, once this bill, if and when this bill reaches the House floor or Senate floor for an actual vote in Pennsylvania, we would work on an op-ed and getting it published in local newspapers in other local venues to again spread this information, to raise awareness, basically to allow concerned parents and concerned constituents to let them know that this bill is being voted on, and that if it's something that they care about, and if they care about the state of the inclusive classrooms in their school district, they should contact their representative to encourage them to vote for this bill to get it passed. And then the final one is through civic engagement. And so here we have an example of 3 different means that we've been going about it. The first one is using the Georgetown Academic Learning Resource Center. And we have met with Dr. Hollahan in the past, and we have a meeting scheduled with her tomorrow morning to continue to get her input on this project and to hopefully partner with it to give support to it moving forward. Additionally, we are meeting representatives, and next week I'm in the process of setting up meetings with my local state representatives, both my state senator and my state representative, to pitch this idea to them and to give them this bill and to talk to them about it and see if they're interested in potentially sponsoring it or supporting it and bringing it to the rest of their colleagues. And then finally, we also have a number of organizations that we're talking to. An example of this is the Parents Education Network, and this is where an organization that shares whose mission statement reflects our morals and values on this project. And Brendan has a meeting with the executive director next week to talk into more information about exactly what our idea is and how they can contribute to it, and if we can tie these things together. So now I will allow Erin to talk about the actual bill.
Okay, so we thought the best way to go about this was to draft a bill that we could get on the assembly floor. And this bill specifically is looking to allocate funding for grant writing subsidies when these grants that schools and districts apply for are designed to benefit inclusive classrooms and related professional development. This is kind of following off research we've learned in the past about what are the most effective uses of inclusive classrooms in mainstream settings and how professional development will benefit that in the future. So this
this is a bill you wrote. The number is just the
correct.
Number
it's just an arbitrary number.
Okay.
So this bill basically looks at the way schools apply for these grants. So schools will generally apply through the e-grant system online for Pennsylvania, and we want to get to that source and provide incentives for schools and districts to apply to grants that benefit these environments, these inclusive classroom environments and related professional development. So we believe a subsidy in the form of a maximum of $2,500 be paid out on behalf of, these subsidies are going to be used for the grant writers or the grant contractors that the states will use to develop these grant applications, and then the states will send them in, or the schools and districts will send them in, and they will be given the subsidy to kind of offset the costs of what the grant writers or the contractors were paid, whether in salary or whether it was in fees from a third-party vendor. So we want $100,000 to be allocated for this purpose, and for financing the subsidies themselves and for related activities that I'll go into detail later. That number is kind of arbitrary right now. That's something that we can revise upon further advice from our contacts in the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania. So the subsidies are going to be a maximum of $2,500, but it will vary between how much the grant writers are paid. We took that number from an estimate of the average salary of a grant writer in Pennsylvania, and then relayed that onto how long it generally takes to make a grant, so that we can figure out the best number, and that can also be reformed upon advisement. So these states have to be eligible to get the subsidy, first off, and they have to employ a grant writer or prove that they have gotten contracts from an outside company to have a grant writer in-house to write this application. But they also have to prove that their grant benefits the inclusive classroom environment as well, or professional development that is related to inclusive classroom environments. Also, they have
to. Saying this is what each school district
has to prove in terms to be eligible for the subsidy. So, additionally, they have to meet an AIDS ratio requirement. And we have information on AIDS ratio, how they are calculated for each school and each district. But we're looking at an AIDS ratio of 250 so that we can get more participation from poorer schools generally. Yeah.
And then just to give some context to the age ratio, because that would eliminate roughly about the top 40 to 30% of the wealthiest school districts who have the lowest age ratio.
Right.
Just for context.
Mm-hmm.
Define what the age ratio is?
So the AIDS ratio is
Do
basically,
you want the formula?
yeah, we have,
I just want to know what it
Okay.
right. So an AIDS ratio kind of gives you an idea of how much state dollars are going into the schools versus how much taxpayer dollars are going into the schools. So if you're in a school district that has higher property taxes,
Got it.
then
It's a
more
local
money.
state ratio.
Yeah.
Right, so it's
Thanks,
coming
that's
from a
all I
different source rather than from the states, or if the school area generally has more money. So those eligibility is required about having the grant be for inclusive classrooms or professional development. They have to prove that they're employing a grant writer or that they have a contract out for one, and they have to be within the AIDS ratio requirement as well. And then another component to this is the awareness. We're going to ask that the Department of Education in Pennsylvania give a 90-day notice about the eligibility and the terms of the subsidy so that states have time to develop grants, employ grant writers, and generally prepare for it. And these grant subsidies will be on a first come, first served basis. We didn't want to limit the number because it's more important to us that they're quality grants rather than just the first ones through the gate in that sense. But the number of subsidies that will be available will be contingent upon how quickly the funds run out. And along with the information that is giving out in terms of letting state schools and districts know about the subsidy, we also want to have a hotline or telephone service available so that states and schools and districts can call in for assistance on the subsidy. And we are looking at maybe a possible option into that to kind of save a bit of money or offset some costs is to partner with an already existing hotline through the Department of Education. So that can be segued in that way rather than creating an entirely different one. And lastly, yeah?
We'll get it finished.
Okay. Lastly, there will be reports that will have to be drafted within a certain amount of time after the end of the grant to prove that, to show classroom progress reports or standardized testing relative to what the school districts or schools themselves have proposed.
So let me just ask one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And this, there's lots of them for us. This is not meant as a sarcastic question.
Yeah.
Just, what kind of grant writers are schools going to need to get the grant to get a grant writer?
I'm sorry?
In other words, this is a grant itself, right, that schools are out to do to get. So if the problem is that people don't apply to this because they don't have grant writers, how do they get this grant?
Well, they're not
Especially
applying.
if you're getting a lot of them.
They're not applying to the subsidy. They're applying to the relative grant that the subsidy is eligible for. And then if they apply to that with funds available and it meets all of the eligibility requirements, they will receive the subsidy back.
But they have to prove that it meets the eligibility.
Correct.
It seems like a good amount of work to get a pretty small amount of money too.
Well,
For that.
I mean,
Did you guys finish your presentation?
No.
Sorry.
Why don't you go through it? Keep going, yeah, we'll come back.
am I next? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. So, in working with this aspect, in order to enact change, we recognize that when you're working with Congress, you do have to be a little idealistic in order to reach a goal and want to achieve it. But at the same point, that doesn't mean you can't sacrifice pragmatism. And we recognize that Pennsylvania is a purple state. That means that there's a Democratic governor and Republican-controlled Senate and state General Assembly, or state House of Representatives. Now, given historic Republican trends, they tend to be less willing to spend money. So in order to make sure that this bill gets passed, the way that we're going to have to generate support is through a grassroots campaign, meaning that we're going to have to incentivize their constituents. Now, we'll be able to rely on this primarily if, in fact, this is not a contentious issue. At the core of it, while yes, there is spending money, but we're not labeling it in partisan tide, because the idea of helping children and helping those children achieve better and achieve higher results will play to economic terms, will play to parental terms, that go across party lines and party divides. So we'll be able to soothe over some of those rather contentious issues that can sometimes bog down legislation. Now the first way that we'll be combating this, Brad, do you mind if you pass the iPad around? Is our infographic. Now this infographic is meant to give a general overview of what learning disabilities are, and to show that over the past decade, progress has been made with the status of learning disabled students in the schools, but there still remains significant areas of improvement for them to engage in. So, first of all,
Brendan, if I can interrupt you,
Yes.
you can scroll up and down because it's so long.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
zoom in there too, probably.
Sorry,
Yes.
go ahead.
On the
these are designed primarily for digital viewing and consumption. So first looking at the national level, we have the IDEA compliance. So IDEA is the federal law that mandates how schools have to operate within, for students that do not work within the general education environment. So the closest parallels to it is like the American Disabilities Act for K through 12, focusing on education. So if we look at this, we see that out of all 50 states, only 30% are in compliance with it. The other 70% are not in compliance. And you will notice that Pennsylvania is in the 30% that is in compliance. So we already know that Pennsylvania is a good environment that is looking to create a healthy place for students to go to school, especially catering to those with learning disabilities. And looking as well, we have a breakdown of special education students, the ones that IDEA serves. And the primary block of them, this group up here, 47% are those with learning disabilities. So things like dyslexia, dyscalculia, time management issues. So the primary block that we're looking to address are these learning disabled students. So a large constituency base that make up the IDEA legislation. And you'll see as well, this cuts across a wide swath of other issues that will also be benefited by inclusive classroom. So while our primary focus is learning disabled students, you will be seeing a variety of other groups benefited from this result through trickle-down effects. Now looking more specifically with learning disabled students and general education, we see that currently, at the present time, 80% of those students spend, the majority of the students spend 80% or more of the day in a general education classroom. The rest, a smaller percent, about 40%, spend less than 40% in the general education classroom. That means that they're being grouped with students that may have Down syndrome or emotional disorders that need a special kind of treatment that those with learning disabilities don't necessarily need. So, but you will notice as a general trend since 2012, there's been a 19% increase presence of students with learning disabilities in the general education classroom, which suggests a trend that people are beginning to realize that these students are able to function within the general education environment once given the proper resources. And this grant, or this process that the schools are going to be able to acquire those grants, will be able to bump this number up even further until we see total, or as close to total as feasibly possible, integration.
Wait, I don't mean to interrupt you, but is
Yes.
that, you said a general trend that suggests that people are starting to see the need for that? Is that the suggest part, like you have data for that, or is that your interpretation? Because couldn't it just be that like, people are paying less attention to it? You are identifying and pulling out special needs?
Yeah, so I acquired this data from the state of learning disabilities. So it's a comprehensive overview of this, and this is one of the conclusions that they reached. Obviously, I wasn't able to put all the statistics in the infographic, but that is one of the conclusions that they've drawn. And then just the final aspect over here, we see an increase in the trend of students with learning disabilities that are graduating from high school, and a decline in the number of learning disabled students that are dropping out. So again, we see a positive trend where people want to assist those with learning disabilities. They're beginning to drop that stigma that says spending money on these will be a black hole or something that people don't want to spend money on. They're beginning to be recognized as a group that are worth having the money spent on. But at the same point too, we have to remember that 80% of general education students graduate with a high school diploma. So that's an 11% difference between students with learning disabilities and the general education environment. So there is still significant room to improve. And of course, at the bottom here, there is a Facebook and Twitter campaign not created yet. This would obviously go into effect once the bill is onto the floor and there's significant traction for it, or in those beginning stages, to allow people to connect to it digitally and link them to the more statistical aspects of it to show that there is evidence behind this. And then over here, we have a QR code which would allow them to scan and link them to the petition. That is a secondary aspect of it. Yes.
Just a really quick clarifier. The purpose of this infographic is to generate grassroots support for the bill in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And that is going to, the way it's going to be shown is by first giving the general overview of what learning disabilities are, and that there's
Come back to that.
improvement.
I just
Yes.
was clarifying the audience.
Yes. And then this will link them to the petition that they will sign to show that the representatives and the senators in the Pennsylvania General Assembly that there is support, widespread support, and if they do support this issue, they're not going to have to worry necessarily about constituent backlash. No. Sure.
So I'll be talking about steps that we have moving forward. So as Brad mentioned earlier in the op-ed, we're working closely with the National Association of Special Education Teachers and have been working with them on both in informational, on an informational basis and exchanging materials from our group. But first of all, with the op-ed, they have both a weekly and a monthly newsletter. So once we were able to get this bill on the floor to garner support to get this bill on the floor for Pennsylvania, we'd place an op-ed in one of their newsletters to be able to give this issue more, or to make people within the community of special education teachers also more aware of this issue. We have continuing conversations with people in Pennsylvania, from school superintendents, school boards, and state representatives to gain, I guess, a wider base for awareness on this issue. Third, we're also working with the National Association of Special Education Teachers, among other organizations, to see if we can partner and further develop this initiative to get this bill on the floor. Now that's
That's our presentation.
Okay.
presentation. Feel free to ask questions.
Go ahead.
Wasn't sure if other people were speaking. It wasn't because the content was so complete. Can I start?
Please.
Let me start with a broad question. So let's say you actually got this in and it worked. What results do you expect to see in improvements in education over what time? How would this outline what success looks like after, if the bill actually is there? What happens? How does this change the system in a way that you desire?
I will do that one. So the ideal way that this would pan out is that by giving these subsidies to schools for them to supply grant writers to be able to get these kinds of grants for students with learning disabilities that we talked about, ideally they would get the grant. That's number one.
So what kinds of grants are available that would actually affect this?
One grant that we found or do you want to talk about this one? Okay, so one grant that we found was in IDEA. There is a grant available that would support teachers in their education to be able to take classes at local colleges and universities that are specific to teaching students with learning disabilities or learning disorders. So,
do you have any idea what the success rate is for that?
well, unfortunately, we don't.
When I contacted the woman who's in charge of the administration stuff for that, she said that's not publicly available info.
Do you know how much money is available annually for it?
Oh, I can't remember the number off the top of my head. But I mean, and that's the general federal level, but at the state level, the e-grant system, we don't have access to that. So we don't see what grants are available. That's kind of an issue we've run into in the past.
Okay, let me ask you two other general questions and then open it up. So on the so for this, the question I was asking before about you've got an argument. It's kind of an arduous grant to get grant writers. Why not just have a formula grant where school districts, they have to still show that they can use it, but why make them go through all these efforts to get this?
Well,
Can I just ask a clarifying question? The efforts that you're concerned about, such as the proving that you have a grant writer.
Well, they have to apply, right? They're not getting this automatically.
well,
Right?
Can
Did
I
I read
go?
that right?
Like the purpose of the subsidy, you're not applying for the subsidy. You're applying for a grant that's already available through eGrant system. But if you can prove that it's if it meets all these eligibility requirements, you can get that subsidy money back.
I'm looking, the
So it adds
subsidy
on to the
money,
grant, so you get like plus 2,500 in the grant? Is that essentially what happens?
yeah, subsidy from whom that you're getting back, sorry.
So the way we envision this working, again, we're very open to
No,
advising.
you're
moving
playing with it,
forward.
I get it, it's just the way it is.
So the way we have it structured right now is that a school finds a school identifies a grant that they want to apply for, and then they go.
Yeah.
They go
After you get the grant, the state will give you back 2,500 of what you spent to get it?
Yes, except we're not. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but we're not restricting it to schools who actually get the grant. If you just
If you've applied for the
completion
grant,
of the application
you get
is enough to get
reimbursed.
that
Do
back.
you get
Got
reimbursed?
it,
Yes.
okay, all right, that's
that-
helpful.
That we should do that.
And then the last general question, and then I'm sure we'll go, but I'll just do one because we're done so much. So, just about, do you have you mentioned the political makeup of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, which is great that you do that. Do you have a sense of, like, how many members, how many votes do you need to get this stuff to get through? How many people do you need to, and I don't know the answer to that. by the way. Do you know?
Yes. We haven't begun conducting exhaustive lobbying research yet, but the general gist is that it's a very slim majority to the Republicans. We do have the benefit of a Democratic governor who has expressed interest in lobbying for education. And again, based off, we will
But
find
just how many
statistics
votes
for-
does it take to get a bill through the general, how many House members and how many senators have to vote yes to get a majority?
It's a simple majority. The numbers are, I can provide this to you later,
Okay.
but it's not, it's no super majorities or anything like that.
Okay.
So I have one general question and then some more specific items. First, my general question is, are there examples of other reimbursement, and I would use the term reimbursement,
Okay.
not subsidy, by the way. I think that's more accurate to what you're proposing here. But are there examples either in Pennsylvania or in any other state where a state is reimbursing anyone, school district, childcare, whomever, for applying for a federal grant? Is that something that's commonly done?
We actually haven't done research on that specifically, but that's something we can look into.
I would look into
Okay.
whether, because because you're getting into levels of government and federal funds and state matching funds. Would this apply as a there's levels of complexity here in terms of levels of government. And if there are other states that do this, and there may very well be, I don't know the answer to the question, then you have a winner because you can model this directly on something that somebody else is doing. If this is a first of a kind program, you've got a real uphill battle.
Yeah. And I just want to comment that your suggestion to use reimbursement, not subsidy, is going to significantly help our future research because we're using the term subsidy and it was leading us a certain direction, but I think that'll definitely help moving forward.
One other general question, then I'll get specific. The federal grants that you're talking about, now I'm sure you're aware that a lot of education money is block granted to states, is not direct application by the school or the district or the teacher. Are these grants that you're talking about, are you certain that they are direct grants and not part of a block grant that's going to the state already?
Well, what our research has told us, because we know of some grants in IDEA from the federal level that are awarded to states on a statewide basis, and then they allocate those funds separately that way.
But are they by merit or by automatic formula distribution?
Okay.
Yeah, look into how those funds are granted, because a lot of those funds are actually given to the State Department of Education,
Right.
either by merit or by formula, and then it is the State Department of Education that is responsible for distributing those to schools. So check on where that flow goes. So let me get a little specific before turning over. If this, and the reason why I asked about the audience for this infographic, if the purpose of this infographic is to specifically speak to people in Pennsylvania, grassroots people in Pennsylvania, about supporting a Pennsylvania-specific piece of legislation, there is no Pennsylvania-specific information on that infographic, and it is incredibly jargon-heavy. So my suggestion would be to, it's a very nice looking infographic, and I see where you're going with it. I think you're on the right track in terms of trying to break this issue down and provide context for people to understand it. Kudos on that. You might take a new look at it from the Pennsylvania lens, and my recommendation is to try and, anytime you've got an acronym, anytime you've got a piece of jargon, take it out. Because if you're speaking to the grassroots, you've got to really make this something that they're going to understand why this hits home for them, not why this is a system-wide acronym-filled problem that they're trying to.
Speaking to your first notice about this being too national, it was actually something I was concerned about. The issue was the data that I could find regarding the status of Pennsylvania education was severely dated. So this was just published last year, and yes, unfortunately it was national, but what was readily available to the public from Pennsylvania was not anything that was current enough to be useful. It would appear very dated. So that is one issue that is coming forward. Now, obviously, we don't have the means or resources to run our own analysis or pull data.
But you use the same data, so that's not exactly what you're saying, right? It doesn't seem, and I have the same complaint, it doesn't seem like you have a very human-centered perspective. You could use the same data, you could use the same, but if you think of it from your audience's perspective, it seems like you could have come up with better ways, even the same data, to explain it, to convey it.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the issue of how much this particular data relates to what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
Right.
And just one question, and just about what you said is, so I'm just trying to make mental notes to move forward with this. Is so the info or the image on the one paper that we provided, would that be something that you think would be more specific, or is that still too jargon heavy?
I mean, this is interesting if I were a superintendent of a school district.
So
If I were
specific.
a parent wanting to know how this is going to make my kid's life better, or life better for my school district, this doesn't.
Okay.
So in
You
short,
already have to be worried about IDEA as a notion for this to actually have any meaning.
Also, nowhere in any of these
You were
things do
done.
you define IDEA.
Yeah, man.
Okay.
All right,
At least do that.
I've talked enough.
Still got a question, and it's really basic. I may have this wrong, so just tell me straight up if I do, okay? But it seems to me that all of this is based on the fact that there's static between the existence of grants and the fact that schools just are not producing applications for those grants. Furthermore, I think all of this is based on your notion that the reason why schools are not applying for these grants is that they either have no one who can or will write applications to those grants. But I haven't heard a reason why that's the case, right? So let me just finish the question. What if reimbursements are available and the schools still aren't applying for the grant? How do you know it's the writing?
well, we call the individual school districts I called my school district, just to get a
Is it
more
in
comprehensive
Pennsylvania?
No, we did not, but we wanted to get a more varied perspective on the issue. So we did call the Pennsylvania school district as a district specific. So I want to kind of distinguish those terms, because I know in Pennsylvania, a district may just be one school, but I
Pennsylvania
know.
districts are very small, whereas in other states.
Yeah, so in
districts
my
can be
state,
quite large.
for example, we have a school district with 100 high schools within that one district. So just to kind of clarify that, it may mean different things based on what area and state you're in. And the perspectives that we got was that For my state specifically, they have grant writers for each type of grant just for that school district, and they very effectively are able to apply for these grants because they have a board of grant writers available at hand that work full-time for the school district. In Pennsylvania, that's not the case, and the perspective that we've got is it's a very convoluted process, and a lot of teachers have to take their own individual initiative, and then when they finally get to the point of writing the grant, because yes, they know it's available, but the feedback that we got was that once they get to that point of writing it, it just becomes a very difficult and arduous process. They need to outsource somebody to write the grant for them because it can be a very full-time, consuming process of going about it. And when they finally if they don't have a grant writer working full-time, which in Pennsylvania they don't, they have to pay for someone to do it for them. And so that's the issue.
So some school districts have grant writers.
Some schools don't, yeah.
Which in Pennsylvania, because the vast majority of school districts are already so small, it's not worth it financially for them to keep a full-time grant writer.
But didn't you also get school districts that told you, related to that question, that, because we'd asked this too, that this was not their priority, that if they had grant writers, that this is not what they most want?
Right. So I can answer that question because my school district was one of those. I'm from Southern California, and with my school district, one thing that I heard from both the legislative aide and the representative's office and for the variety of people I spoke to in the school district was saying that, some schools have other priorities. For example, my school district, because of the recession, budget cuts and everything, we recently lost a lot of teachers in both mainstream education and special education. So one of their focuses is trying to get funding to get those teachers back. So students with learning disabilities aren't necessarily at the top of their priority list. The director of special education in my school district was, trying to work on it, but this definitely was more of a side project. In speaking with, other grants, yeah, schools have other priorities, but we'd like to have this and make it a priority.
So why Pennsylvania?
Why Pennsylvania?
I can speak to that. They're both from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And
that could be a good enough reason.
No, I mean that's a great reason in itself, and it's a good environment, and they have great contacts in Pennsylvania, in the legislature itself.
Okay.
We all met with our representatives in the when they met with
Yeah,
their
that-
representatives,
that
they were
was
the most
fair.
responsive. I know when I met with my representative, they kind of just were very flippant about it, and there was a lot we could work
Federal
with.
representative?
Yes.
That's fine. My only suggestion would be if you decide to move forward with a state level piece of legislation, and if Pennsylvania is the way you go because of context, that's great. But there are states out there that have varying policies already on the books about special education, and a little bit of research to find a state that might be a little bit more receptive to this could be worth your while. So just a quick suggestion. And then Slade, I know that you had.
Go ahead.
Just one thing about that too. One reason we were also interested in Pennsylvania is that because it is IDEA compliant, and one of the few schools that it has already invested time and interest in special education. So
That's good.
So, it seems like the moment it's going to focus this is, if I understood you right, Brad, do you have meetings coming up with the states on this?
I'm actually going home next week, and I'm in the process of setting up meetings
Okay,
with my
so let's
representatives.
focus on that moment.
Okay.
All right, so there's a lot of things that you've been talking about, the infographic, op-eds, those aren't going to come into play right away. So let's just put those aside. You have time to improve them in the ways that you've heard. The most immediate thing is preparing for those meetings. So let's think about the best way to prepare yourself for that. I think if there's a single exercise that would be useful for you to think about, it's this. Now, imagine you get your 2-minute moment at a PTA meeting, okay?
Yeah.
And 5 people have just come before you, and there are 5 adamant parents saying exactly what the school ought to be doing, what they ought to be telling their grant writer to do. And one of them says, we need air conditioners. We absolutely got to install air conditioners. That's more important than anything else. It's a miserable environment in the classroom. It doesn't matter what else is going on. So that is the most immediate need. The next parent gets up and says, we don't have enough teachers, right? We don't have teachers. We got too many students in the classroom. The reason it's hot, it's not just the air conditioners. It's like we got 30 students in a classroom. The next person gets up and says, you know what? It's the classrooms themselves that are in bad shape. We're trying to cram too many into too small of a space. We need another classroom. And then finally, there's some really novel idea, which is, you know what? Education has to happen outside the classroom. We've got to work on the playground. We've actually got to expand our playground. And now you get your 2 minutes. All that has happened before you. What are you going to try to say, what are you going to say to swing the room in your favor? One of you can answer this in just a couple of minutes, which means you don't have the opportunity to do all of this. You don't have the opportunity to make all the arguments you just made. You've got to give me your one compelling point why, as important as those other 5 things are, it's actually your issue that they've got to focus on. Okay? Whatever you answer, take a minute to think about it. That should be what you tell the representative and the senator next week when you meet with them. So what is your 2-minute moment at a PTA meeting?
Do you want that right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you've thought about this more than anybody else in the room, so,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I
one of you 5
Okay, and I can answer.
choose and just give it.
Yeah, it
got
sounds like a
something
great
too.
setup for a joke.
Let's hope that didn't want to
Did
happen.
they walk into a bar?
Excuse me. The message that I would try and get across, the exact phrasing of that message obviously is still going to be defined, but the exact message would be that
Make it conversational.
Okay.
So don't talk about it as a message.
Okay.
Just this is your 2 minutes. You want to get there and try to
Okay.
persuade the room that actually,
Okay.
despite all those other things they said, which are important. And this is what every school is facing, right? Exactly this priority issue that you confront.
Yeah.
So let me hear it in a conversational way.
we all know that, especially in the state of Pennsylvania, the existence or the state of school finance and funding is a great issue, and schools all over the state are facing these issues. By supporting this bill, HB 526, you would not only be able to address a real issue in your school district of learning disabled students, but you would be able to address that issue by receiving essentially more free money. And that would be the crux of my argument.
Give it a shot. I mean, so your selling point came right at the end, which is this is free money.
Is that
So-
because especially in Pennsylvania school districts, usually unless there's a grant they feel very passionate about, they won't hire a grant writer to do it, and they'll just have assistant superintendents or other.
Oh, no, I get the argument, but
We're going to bribe you to think that ours is most important.
Pretty much.
yeah.
I mean, it's just legit.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm just wondering, are there other approaches that you guys have?
I think something that the first thing that came to my mind when you started talking about these things is that the other things you were talking about are things that benefit everyone in the classroom, not just a certain segment of the population. But in the inclusive classroom environment and the related professional development that comes out of that, everyone benefits, not just learning
I'd
disabled
like to start,
students.
in what it benefits in what way?
In the fact of whether it's socialization or acceptance of other types of people and how people learn, or other learning tractions.
And how are those things explained through test scores? How's it determined? How are those things determined?
How
The
do we
things you just
quantify
mentioned. Yeah, how
how
is
it's
that-
benefiting everyone? I think you do have.
I don't have the data directly right in front of me, but there's data to show that mainstream students do better on emotional intelligence exams as well as standardized exams when they employ the same learning methods that learning disabled students in mainstream
Test
classrooms
scores for your student, your son and daughter can go up if you do this.
beyond test scores beyond just the academic test scores. Like there's studies for the emotional aspect and the emotional development as well.
Got it. Were there other arguments too?
Yes.
Okay.
There's 3 more.
Priyanka, go.
All right. So in looking at Professor Slake, you talked about all of these issues, and all of them involve that you have limited resources, which is true. So what we want to do is work within the resources and the means that you have. So by training teachers, if you have 30 students in a classroom, but one trained teacher who can be responsive to the learning issues and difficulties of a wider variety of students, then you're better equipped overall. So by making this environment, as Erin said, better for not only just the students with learning disabilities in the classroom, but by making them better for all students in the classroom by having a teacher equipped to respond to them, would be the best way to work within the means that you have, because you don't have to build a separate playground with desks, or I don't even know how that works, or have other air conditioners or whatever it is. You're working within your means without, necessarily expanding in extraneous areas in an effective way that would help all students. And 2 more.
The idea of universal inclusive classroom really came to us from Dr. Holohan from her personal experience, and that when she didn't receive specific training when she just was pretty much notified that she was going to have some special ed kids in her classroom, and something that she said was that she had to improvise a lot of her techniques, and I think that it was a way that she was able to include all students within her classroom to make it effective for everyone. It wasn't, for example, in the special education system, they have to pay for a special ed teacher or a regular teacher. So if we give them the training, it becomes more cost effective for them because you have one teacher that can teach all types of students that benefits everyone, not just two separate programs. So you have to have two classrooms for special education students and regular mainstream students.
Okay, and then you have one more.
Yes, and I guess, in terms of coming up with one blanket argument, it's very difficult to do in Pennsylvania, given that it's really two states in one.
Just remember the scenario I put you in.
Yes.
You got 2 minutes.
Yes.
You're just gonna have to acknowledge that you only have that limited amount of time to make your case. Okay. Good.
Yes. Yeah, so I guess the caveat, it really depends which school district, which representative you're talking to. Because if you're talking to someone from either the East Coast or the West side of the state, you can use the same argument, but you're going to tailor it differently.
So the situation I put you in was a
Yes.
PTA moment, right?
Yes.
And I'm saying you can learn from that example to figure out what's your best argument you can
Yes.
take to a set of reps. So
Okay.
I'm going to put you back in that you're talking to PTA right now.
Okay.
Several parents just spoke before you, each to their own particular interest, and now it's your turn.
PTA outside Pittsburgh to take care of.
Okay. Outside Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So, there we go. Best way, you're getting a 2-for-1 deal. Working through this way, yeah, working through a 2-for-1 deal. This way, you're going to have not only have the opportunity to apply for the grant and receive the funding back, then using that funding, which you'll receive back, then you can invest it in the air conditioners, or you can invest in an addition on the school.
Okay.
This way, you're proving that you can use the grant funds on the
Got it.
test scores.
And I'm not going to critique any of your
Yeah.
arguments right now, but what I wanted to point out is you got, how many in your group? 5. How many different reasons? 5. You haven't come together as a group to tell me what is the best reason for doing this. So part of the exercise is to let you see for yourselves. You got too many arguments on the table and not enough agreement among you to figure out what's the best approach.
So you mentioned the grassroots campaign, which involves a series of artifacts, potentially, right? The infograph, a petition, a Facebook page, potentially, and maybe the op-ed too. And I think it was mentioned at least 2, maybe 3 times that the idea was once a bill's on the floor, you will unleash the grassroots campaign. My question is, why not?
Yeah.
Right.
It makes sense to me that this drives
Yeah.
this as
Yeah.
opposed to like, waiting.
Right.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would take it as advice.
And-
What's the question you
And,
can answer?
and just I won't explain. Yeah, you're right.
I have the same reaction. I mean, if the bill is on the floor, you're already like 90% of the way there. The next 10% can kill you, but still, 90% done. Can I ask one more question? So, the politics, you were sort of giving a, let's say, fairly positive, even Pollyannish view of where the politics are. So, what do you expect to run into? I mean, what's the evidence that all these IDA issues are, so accepted now, given limited money, and that this is what people are gonna wanna put their money into? What are you gonna have to do to overcome the particular barriers you think you're gonna get, besides showing the public's behind you, but what arguments are you gonna have, what kinds of arguments are you gonna have to counter and how?
The primary argument we're going to have to counter is obviously this bill requires that money is being spent. So, that's going to come up to opposition no matter who you're presenting it to. And one primary way that we're looking at doing it is A, keeping the cost small. $100,000 is a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of budgeting, there is a little bit more flexibility with that, but also trying to cut costs. We mentioned trying to merge with the idea of a hotline that would provide information about the grant or the reimbursement program through the schools would be merged with an existing hotline that run by the Pennsylvania Department of Education that already deals with special education related issues. So using that to expand its purview and assisting that staff on that issue to expand that purview would significantly cut costs and having to create and maintain the existing hotline. So that's one way of cutting costs. The secondary aspect of it too would be this would be, I guess, more the digging into it deeply, but trying to be creative with where exactly the budget is working. I was looking through the Pennsylvania's budget and looking specifically at the education, and there are funds not necessarily left over, but that leave room to be reappropriated creatively, depending on what exactly the wording of the specific bill is. So again, it's going to be a lot of minutia that we have to shift through and specific wording, but there are ways to ensure that the money that we do have spent appears minimal and can be minimized and cut as efficiently as possible.
It already appears really minimal. Wait, is it my like that? First off, was that what you? Like it seems like you're very concerned with the amount of money. It doesn't seem like a lot of money. I don't think you can buy new air conditioners.
When you're talking about money.
Is this a typo? Is it $2,500?
Well, I mean,
Per
that is
school?
something, that's something
Or
that
per
can be,
district or?
It's all the same.
Oh, okay.
So how many school districts are there?
The 3,300.
schools.
Wait, so that's not enough to buy to like hire a grant writer, right?
Actually,
So it's only, and you require that they have a grant writer. So okay, a few things, and I think it comes down to money. You require that they have a grant writer to get it, but this isn't enough to hire one.
No.
So what are you motivating exactly? If you're only giving money back, rebates back to people who have grant writers, how does that motivate people to get grant writers?
right.
Do it. Hold on, I have another question to add to that. Is anyone actually going to be motivated to do any amount of work to get to change their role for $2,500 for an entire school?
Can I explain where we got that $2,500
No,
idea from?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Because we looked up salary info on how the average grant writer in Pennsylvania is, what their annual salary is basically. And we calculated that into an hourly wage that was equivalent. And then we looked up information on how long it took on average to write a grant, like an education grant, and we superimposed those. So if it took a certain amount of hours and then they were being paid on average this amount of money per hour, then that's the amount we came up with.
So you hired someone to do it.
Right, so there's
For
two
just-
options. Like they have two eligibility options.
Contract out.
They can either contract out or they have one in-house already.
Which almost no Pennsylvania schools have a grant writer in-house normally.
Right. So why not? So I think you should increase the amount of money that you give people, and I think that you do it in a way that synthesizes your pitches, or at least a number of them. Why not say to that representative that you came up to the PTA meeting, hey, the 5 people that just came up here, the 5 people behind me, like, why don't you do everything that they want, plus what I want, by hiring like a stable of, which you mentioned to me before, like of grant writers, just in general, for education, for K-12 education issues, including getting grants in-state and out-of-state for playgrounds and classrooms and air conditioners. Plus, like, let's mandate that, they at least apply to a number of special education grants a year.
Can I clarify what you're at? Like you're kind of theorizing whether we should just create this amount of money so that schools can have a stable of grant writers, like in-house or at the state level? Either.
I think you can spend more money to get more. You might need to spend more money to get this.
Because like there's
If you have
already
50 if you have 50 parents in your district to get $50 each, they've already raised the money. You're not faster than the state.
Yeah, I mean, that dollar amount, we're not
We're not married to that
and,
idea.
and we're perfectly willing to restructure that upon further advisement.
But what, well, go ahead.
So, and adding to that, yeah, we recognize there's a million issues that are important in these school districts, but our focus was on creating inclusive classrooms, especially for the benefit of students with learning disabilities, and we've seen through data that these can be beneficial for mainstream students as well. That was the main point of ours. Our goal with this was not to fix the entire education system.
No, I just meant it as a suggestion as a tactic.
No, I mean, it
Like,
makes
hey,
sense.
I got married, just this piece of it. But there's other ways. I just think you shouldn't be married to it, you should increase it. As soon as you go to like a representative and ask them for money, you can't ask them for you can't change your mind after that.
Well, the difficulty was that because the school system in Pennsylvania is so decentralized, if you wanted to do a stable system for grant writers, you'd have to have so many that you'd be really looking at a lot of inefficiencies. Well, while that system might work in a state like Nevada or California, where you see these large super school districts combining, tens of thousands of students, and these systems might work better in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or Pittsburgh, where you see these large districts. But the majority of Pennsylvania is rural and is composed of small school districts that have 4 or 5 schools in them with maybe 2,000 students total. So it wouldn't be economical or necessarily efficient to maintain 5 grant writers to look at a wide variety of issues. So we really have to tailor this bill to try and meet the general environment of Pennsylvania, which is that decentralized system and that give and take system where, you know, here's an issue now, I want to grab this grant writer now while for this limited amount of money, use it and go.
Are
And
those small school districts, we'll finish up, but 2 things.
Yeah.
One is whether those, and I don't expect you to know this, but are those small school districts actually better or worse able to handle the learning disabled problem now? In other words, is there a mismatch or a match between who needs the money
Right.
and who's actually got the problem? And the other is if, in terms of the amount of money, and I like the way, the fact you did that calculation and the way you did it, but it'd actually be useful to know, sometimes you get sort of a false precision there, and actually the way they're actually paid, they're getting way more than that, or you can't actually divide up the pieces. So it'd be interesting if you could find out, by calling around, maybe you already did some of this, what are they getting per contract? Can you actually get
That's what
someone
they
for
get cost to hire.
$2,500?
It's cost to hire a grant writer.
Can I just say one thing?
Actually, we're winding down now,
But should we just look at just
No, I was going to say one issue that we're dealing with trying to combat is that in Pennsylvania, a large number of grant writers, when actually they do hire the grant writers, get paid a portion of the grant, which is illegal. And so, but that is going on.
Oh, so that's important to know.